evening. I'm Charles Duffy, and this is Political Pulse. Tonight we have the great Jules Witcover, veteran newspaperman, wrote for the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Baltimore Sun, and also author of many books. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I've kind of focused on a couple of your books, and those are about White Knight, about Spiro Agnew, a biography about Spiro Agnew, and Very Strange Bedfellows, about the Nixon-Agnew presidency and their relationship. But Maryland politics is kind of an interesting, I know you've kind of watched Maryland politics and written about it, but Agnew kind of fits into that whole interesting mold, I would say.
Well, there was always the taint of corruption in Maryland politics, and in fact, when Agnew finally was confronted with those allegations which amounted to bribery, one of his defenses was, well, that was the way business always was conducted in Maryland politics.
Right. And one of the things that amazes me about Agnew is his rise. 1960, when Nixon was running for the presidency against John F. Kennedy, barely lost, Agnew was running for Baltimore County Circuit Judge. He lost that race, lost for Baltimore County Council later. 1965 was the Baltimore County Executive. 1966, the governor of Maryland. 1969, he was the vice president of the United States. There hasn't been that many more, quick rises like that.
Yeah, it was quite amazing. And to me, the most amazing part was the way he got elected governor of Maryland. He was a Republican nominee against a severe segregationist Democratic candidate named George Mahoney. And many Democratic voters couldn't vote for him, so they turned to Agnew, and that's how Agnew got elected,
so back
governor.
Then, when he was the governor, he was thought of as moderate.
At the beginning, he was considered moderate, but when after the assassination of Martin Luther King and the riots in Maryland and in Baltimore particularly, he turned very hard right in terms of a strong defender of law and order. And that, in fact, is how he fell into the Nixon circle. Nixon's strategists and advisors noted Agnew's very stringent, tough reaction to law and order. He was famously held a meeting with moderate black leaders in Maryland and castigated them for not being more critical of the people who he claimed had instigated the riots. Mm-hmm. And that was noticed by the Nixon people, and then they began to think, here's a guy who really fits into our particular position on crime and law and order.
And you also talked about their personal relationship. I mean, Nixon, you said, was kind of like an insecure person. He was taken by men who were kind of confident, strong, and Agnew was one of those types of people.
Agnew definitely fit that picture. He was a very impressive-looking man, ramrod straight as he stood, and very confident. And Nixon was very impressed with Agnew. Of course, one of the reasons that he took him in the first place was that Nixon's campaign took polls to find out who would help the ticket. They found that nobody would help the ticket, and Nixon would run best if he could run by himself, mm-hmm. but he couldn't, and so the next choice was to pick somebody that wasn't that well known.
But Agnew helped in that '68 race. It's in your book that a few of the states, I think it's Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, Agnew helped put Nixon over in a very tight race with Hubert Humphrey.
Yes, it's always hard to prove that a presidential candidate helps a ticket, but the Nixon people did believe that in the southern and particularly border states that he was a help. By this time, Agnew had started to enunciate those hard right views on crime and on dealing with violence. And so that was kind of a bonus for them. They were very surprised and pleased to have Agnew take that role, which is basically the same role of the tough guy, even you could say the hatchet man, that he played himself in his previous career, Nixon. And
as a U.S. senator, and when Nixon was vice president to Eisenhower.
Right. So Agnew was kind of regarded as Nixon's Nixon.
That's an interesting description. But at some point, didn't Richard Nixon think that that Agnew became too much of Nixon's Nixon? In other words, Agnew almost was becoming too popular for Richard Nixon.
Well, there was a feeling, first of all, that he overdid it, which I always was amused to hear that come from from Nixon. But he basically, they were happy to have him as a campaigner. But there were other things about Agnew that bothered them. For one, probably the main thing was that Agnew was under the impression, as a result of what Nixon had told him when he picked him for vice president, that he was going to play a major role in the domestic agenda of the Nixon administration, and it turned out that he did not. That the Nixon administration was basically 3 or 4 people: Nixon, Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, John Ehrlichman, who became the domestic chief, and on the foreign policy side, Henry Kissinger. Agnew was pretty well shut out. He seldom saw Nixon, seldom was even able to get into the Oval Office, and being a very proud man and impressed with his own credentials and abilities, he began to simmer about that, and that was known in the inner circle. And they resisted that push that he was constantly doing to try to be a bigger player in the Nixon administration.
I love the quote by Hubert Humphrey. He called Agnew the brass knuckles of the administration. But Agnew, he had a following, I think, in what you call the silent majority, which you hear a lot about now, the base of the Republican Party. I mean, he developed a good base around the country.
It wasn't only what he said; it was the way he did it. He was a very dramatic and an eloquent speaker. Many said he overdid it. He was known for his alliterations, like nattering nabobs of negativism and other expressions like that. Some of which were his own, and some of which were written by his two speechwriters who were loaned to him from the Nixon campaign. That one would have been Pat Buchanan, who later ran for president himself, and William Safire, who later became a New York Times columnist. So Agnew was a persona, and he was on his way, if things had worked out, to be the next Republican nominee. But one of the problems with Nixon was Nixon didn't want that to happen. And one of the reasons he didn't want it to happen is that he encountered somebody who he thought was more impressive than Agnew. And also with Nixon,
John Connally.
John Connally, with Nixon's inferiority complex, which is rampant, he looked up to Connally, and because
the same
Connally
way he looked up to Agnew before.
But only Connally was more so. He was very masculine. He was a very strong, decisive kind of a person, and his bearing and appearance, he exuded strength. So Nixon started to consider with his closest aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, about replacing Agnew from the ticket in 1972 for re-election with Connally. And then even after, they couldn't pull that off partly because of the popularity that Agnew had achieved, as you mentioned. So after Nixon decided he had to keep Agnew on the ticket. He then thought in the early part of his second term that perhaps he could somehow ease Agnew out of the nomination in 1976 and make Connally the Republican nominee, who by that time had converted from being a Democrat to the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm. And Connally was the ex-governor of Texas and also the Secretary of Treasury for a time.
He originally came into the Nixon administration as a Secretary of Treasury as a Democrat.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that Agnew was never in the inner circle in the Nixon administration, but for Watergate purposes, that actually benefited Agnew.
Yes, he could honestly say that he was not in the loop. In fact, Nixon had originally didn't want Agnew to stay out of his defense on Watergate, but as things began to get more desperate for Nixon, he urged Agnew to speak out for him, and Agnew did, but he didn't really know what the details were. Didn't know the Nixon's involvement in the cover-up or anything like that. So that was in one way, kind of ironically, the fact that he was excluded from the inner circle was a benefit for him.
Mm-hmm. But people, probably a lot of people know that Agnew resigned his vice presidency, and they probably think it relates to Watergate, but it didn't.
No, it had absolutely nothing to do with Watergate, but although Agnew did hope to kind of team up with Nixon in defense, thinking he could make Nixon an ally in his own defense, but Nixon at that point wanted no part of Agnew and wanted him to stay clear of the whole Watergate business.
But Agnew's problems related back to when he was the county executive. He was taking kickbacks from contractors.
Yes, all the way back to when he was county executive. And ironically, the Justice Department never originally went after Agnew. The allegations against Agnew came to light only because the Justice Department was investigating a Democratic successor of Agnew named Dale.
Name escapes me too.
Dale Anderson, I believe it was.
Right.
And in the course of that investigation, some of the people who were accused of bribery said, "Well, we've got a bigger prize for you," and started talking about Agnew to save their own skids.
But there was, it's amazing that, I mean, obviously it was an old alleged act by Agnew. It would have been barred by the statute of limitations, but the fact of the matter is, even when he was the vice president, he kept taking the money.
Yes, that was a shocking thing about it and surprising thing about it, that some of the, and why it happened is really kind of strange too, because he wasn't being given money for anything he was doing as vice president, because I mean the vice president didn't have much in terms of patronage, but some of these old friends from Baltimore who had been paying him off for contracts they received from him as county executive and as governor felt that they were still receiving the benefit of those grants, and they felt, well, Agnew deserves some of it, because if it hadn't been for him, we would have gotten this money. So they came to the White House and made payments to him.
And he took the money, but for the fact that he took the money as a vice president, there would have been statute of limitation problems.
Well, I don't know, because what they actually got him on was income tax evasion, and they did what's known as a net worth investigation. They checked about how much all the money he had spent, and then matched it against his formal income, and concluded that he could have bought all these things if he didn't have another source of income. So that was the only way they really legally got him, and he agreed to take a plea for that charge rather than go to jail.
We just have about a minute left to break, but his defense, as you said, was, hey, where I come from, these payments that's the way you do business when you're a politician.
And he claimed that he never gave them any special benefits, but it was just normal routine business in Maryland, and there was some evidence that was true.
Okay, let's take our break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to get into Watergate a little bit. We'll be right back with Jules Witcover. We're back with Jules Witcover, and we're talking about his book, Very Strange Bedfellows, about Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, and we were talking about Watergate. And as Watergate heated up, Agnew really became what Nixon thought of as Nixon's insurance policy. I mean, Nixon didn't think that Congress was going to impeach him, knowing that Agnew was the vice president.
Yes, he did believe that, but things. This was before the bribery, corruption charges against Agnew became known, and Nixon knew about it fairly soon after the Justice Department and the prosecutors in Baltimore reported to the Justice Department in Washington about going after Agnew. But Nixon pretended to Agnew that he didn't know anything about it. And it was very strange that Nixon's attitude with Agnew, not only in this instance, but in most instances, he he always treated Agnew with great cordiality and friendship and support to his face. But as I said before, behind the scenes, he was calculating with Haldeman and Ehrlichman about how to get Agnew either out of the vice presidency, but certainly out of the line of succession to the presidency, and out of the nomination in 1976, assuming that Nixon would have finished his second term.
Mm-hmm. Well, Agnew ultimately, based on these kickbacks and his IRS problems, he basically pled out in federal court in Baltimore. And this was, I guess, 8 or so months before Nixon resigned, or something like that. And I always wondered if Agnew, it looked like, as I was reading your book, Agnew wanted to fight it out with the feds on his charges, but ultimately, again, he resigned and he basically pled out. But what if he would have fought it out and took the defense? Hey, this is the way things are done, and they had a long trial. How do you think that would have affected whether or not Richard Nixon would have resigned?
Well, I don't think really they were related at all. I think that Agnew, they had so much material on Agnew, although the charge was income tax evasion. They had pretty solid information about these bribery charges. So I think that absent that, it would have affected Watergate, but it was Nixon's own crimes in Watergate which finally resulted in his resignation. I think that would have happened no matter what.
Agnew told Nixon, and this is before the tapes became public, Agnew told Nixon to destroy the tapes.
Yes, Nixon was in hospital for some reason. I forget what it was right now, but
and I'm talking about the White House tapes, Nixon's taping system,
and Agnew went to see Nixon in the hospital, and Nixon asked him what he should do about the tapes, and Agnew said, you should destroy them. Of course, Nixon did do that for various reasons. One of which is it's assumed that he wanted to use the tapes later to write history books, which he finally did with or without the tapes.
Mm-hmm. But maybe if he had destroyed the tapes, and at some point before they were known by the public, it perhaps would not have been obstruction of justice. But it could have saved his presidency, because there were the knowledge that there were tapes and there was information on those tapes that could be used against Nixon, kind of fueled somewhat this whole resignation process, impeachment talk against Nixon.
It's hard to say. It's hard to say I personally believe that the case was so strong against Nixon that he would have been forced to resign.
Mm-hmm. And there was also, you mentioned in your book that, again, I said that it looked like Agnew was going to fight it out at the trial, but maybe one of the reason you intimated in your book why he basically pled out was that the IRS investigation would have turned up money that he had paid or gifts that he had given to a mistress, and so I guess that was maybe the fact that really made Agnew, think about this whole.
That's what the prosecutors alleged to me when I talked to them later, that there were things in those gifts that Agnew would rather have not come to light, and indeed Agnew did say that he was told that if he were convicted, his wife would also be subject to criminal charges because of
taxes,
tax involvements. But Agnew was of a mind to fight it, but for this reason or other reasons he decided not to. And then he finally wrote a book called "Go Quietly or Else," in which he made the case that he'd been railroaded.
Pushed him overboard.
That he'd been railroaded, right?
Yeah. And Nixon and Agnew, they were somewhat similar in that they came from very humble backgrounds. Nixon from Yorba Linda, California, very poor family. I think Agnew was the son of Greek immigrants.
He was.
But were they at all sympathetic? Are they at all sympathetic people to you?
The
Nixon and Agnew. Did you ever see them in a sympathetic light?
Well, I often thought, well, I was once on another television show, and I was asked, what would be one word that you would use to describe your feeling toward Nixon, and I blurted out, sympathy, which may seem a strange thing to say about somebody who had been elected twice to the presidency. But I always felt that this Nixon's galloping inferiority complex, which I referred to earlier, so affected him and his behavior that sometimes you had to feel sorry for him, because even though he was president of the United States, he always thought less of himself than he should have. Mm-hmm. And he always felt inferior, and he tried to react to that sometimes by being more a tough guy and using the language that we came to know he used behind the scenes on the tapes and so on. But yeah, I kind of felt sympathy toward Nixon in a way that he didn't have to be such an insecure man as he was.
I mean, he's very, obviously a very smart man. And you, if you try to put presidents in different eras, I mean, Richard Nixon, I mean, he kind of saw the world, the issues, the complexity of the issues pretty clearly. But you wonder if he would have done something like gone into Iraq.
Well, he used to say that to his aides that he wanted his foreign adversaries to think he was crazy, because that the people in the Kremlin, because if they felt that he was unreliable, they'd be very careful about how they dealt with things. It's a little scary to think that was the way he thought. But you also asked me about Agnew. Agnew was not like that at all. He was very confident of himself, maybe overconfident in himself, and he had a superiority complex, if anything.
Mm-hmm. But was he sympathetic and all? And and I'm talking about Agnew, and I want to read a quote from your book, and this is his last meeting with Richard Nixon in the Oval Office, and it's Agnew speaking. "I was conscious of how tragic the moment was for me and my loved ones. Here I was in the Oval Office for the last time, about to leave in disgrace, the office I had fought and worked so hard. I felt no rancor toward Mr. Nixon, only ahead, burdening sadness. I was about to let a lot of people down. As I was leaving, Nixon put his arms around my shoulders, shook his head, and said again how awful it was. Incongruously, I suddenly had the feeling that he couldn't wait to get me out of there. We shook hands, and I walked numbly out of the Oval Office and out of the White House for what I suppose was the last time." Did you feel any sympathy for Agnew?
I never did. No, because I don't think that was genuine. On the one hand, he said he felt no rancor, but his book revealed terrific rancor toward Nixon, and I think that because Agnew was such a confident, super confident fellow, as opposed to the insecure Nixon, it was very hard to feel sympathetic toward him, because what he did, he brought on himself, just as what Nixon did, he brought on himself. But there was this kind of character weakness that I saw, knowing both men, that I saw in Nixon that I didn't see in Agnew.
And it seems like you love listening to those White House tapes, and you're somewhat, do you love just sitting there and listening to them?
Sure. And not only the tapes dealing with Nixon and Agnew. When I was over at the archives in College Park, I would sometimes find myself sitting there for hours listening to other aspects of the whole Nixon administration, Watergate, and so on, that had nothing to do with this book.
And it's interesting that there's characters that pop up on these tapes, or names are mentioned, and I was interested to see that on the tapes, Nixon was speaking, when he was talking to John Connally, he mentioned Ronald Reagan, who of course was president, and here's what Nixon said: "I know Reagan, I know his strengths, but I also know all of his weaknesses there. You can't have a simplicity man in this position. It's got to be somebody with a broad gauge, who has the fire of leadership, who has the foreign and domestic understanding and the like, and also who's able to work with Congress as president." So isn't it interesting, one president talking about someone who was in the future going to become president?
Nixon was great at making assessments of other people, and at the same time, some of his assessments were pretty bad. There was one in this book in which that I experienced that after in Miami, after Nixon had shocked the Republican Party by picking Agnew as his vice president, held a little press party in Key Biscayne the next day or a couple of days later, and we all sat around his pool and he talked about many things, including picking Agnew. And at one point he said about Agnew, there's a certain thing about, this is a paraphrase of what he said, there's a certain thing about men, you can tell whether they've got it or they don't have it. And this guy Agnew's got it, and if he doesn't, then I've made a real mistake.
I guess he made a mistake. But you've had a long career, and I want to get to something. We only have a couple minutes left, but I think you were covering the Robert F. Kennedy presidential campaign in 1968. I guess it was June. You were in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel when Robert Kennedy was shot. What was that like? Well,
I was standing behind Senator Kennedy when he was making his on the dais when he was making his victory statement in the ballroom of the Ambassador. And then it was decided that he was going to have a press conference, and I turned and walked through this kitchen corridor toward the press room where the press conference was going to be held, and Senator Kennedy was probably about 10 feet behind me, and I heard the shots, turned, and immediately he was on the ground, and then that bedlam in the kitchen ensued, and it was a wild scene. With people screaming and yelling, and two or three of the burly Kennedy bodyguards or people in the campaign struggling to get the gun from the assailant, and it's just a scene that
never forget. But covering politics for 50 years or so, I mean, you've seen a lot of elected people, Nixon, Reagan, Robert Kennedy, people like that. I mean, as you see them, can you sort them out and say, hey, this guy's going to be great, this guy's not, or is it something you can't really tell in the moment?
Well, I mean, there's certain qualities of various people that stick with you. Particularly Robert Kennedy, because I had an interesting experience with him that as a younger reporter, I saw him in his more arrogant days as a young, tough guy in defense of his brother, and I didn't really cotton up to him very much. But as I covered him in 1968, and I saw him kind of almost discover himself as a politician, because before then he had largely been a strategist for his brother, and when he became a senator and became a politician in his own right, I think he came out of that attitude that bothered a lot of people before, and in the course of his own campaign, became a very impressive politician. I think had he been elected, a lot of things that happened here. Happened here in this country would not have happened.
Interesting. Well, it was an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
So much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And remember, if it's Tuesday night at 9:30 or Thursday night at 9, it's Political Pulse on Channel 16 TV. I'm Charles Duffy. We'll see you next week.